A prejudiced restaurant owner sporting a red MAGA hat, an African-American woman, and an ordinary outing quickly escalating into a moment of reckoning. Prepare for a story that exposes the covert biases faced daily by many individuals, bringing hidden prejudices to light. Alicia Brown entered the restaurant with purpose, her confident demeanor instantly commanding attention. Behind the reception stand was Timothy Carter, his bright red MAGA hat perched prominently on his head, clashing starkly with the restaurant's otherwise elegant atmosphere. His expression soured as his gaze landed on Alicia, a smug grin spreading across his face. He leaned forward slightly, scrutinizing her as if appraising a lesser being. "Good afternoon," Alicia greeted, her tone calm yet authoritative. "Table for one, please." Timothy stood straighter, his lips curling into a mocking smile. "We're fully booked," he stated curtly, tapping the reservations book without even glancing at it. Alicia raised an eyebrow, her eyes scanning the dining area where several tables sat empty, their pristine linens undisturbed. She gestured toward the vacant spaces. "I see plenty of open tables. Surely you can accommodate one person." Timothy leaned onto the podium, narrowing his eyes. "Those tables are reserved for the lunch rush," he retorted. Alicia remained composed, her voice steady. "It appears quite slow at the moment." Timothy's grin widened as his tone grew colder. "Look, lady, I don't think this is the kind of place for you. Maybe you should try somewhere a bit simpler." Alicia straightened, refusing to let the insult rattle her. The room's atmosphere shifted as a few patrons subtly turned their attention to the unfolding interaction, though many avoided eye contact altogether. "Excuse me?" Alicia's voice was low, but carried an undeniable strength. Timothy chuckled dismissively, waving a hand. "I said we're full. That's the end of it. You people always want to push until it turns into a problem." Murmurs arose among the diners as the once welcoming ambiance dissolved into palpable tension. Alicia locked eyes with Timothy, her gaze steady and piercing. "I have every right to dine here," she stated, her words tinged with restrained anger. "You know that as well as I do." "Not today, you don't," Timothy snapped, his tone dripping with disdain. End of discussion. Despite the fiery exchange, Alicia stood her ground. Her unwavering posture acted as an anchor against Timothy's escalating hostility. The vivid red of his MAGA hat seemed to amplify his smugness, as if daring her to challenge him further. "I fail to see a legitimate reason why I cannot be seated," Alicia pressed, her tone even yet firm. "Unless there's another reason you're unwilling to admit?" Timothy let out a low, mocking laugh, crossing his arms. "I don't owe you any explanations. This is my restaurant, my rules, and I say you're not eating here. That's final." Alicia's jaw tightened, but she remained measured. "You're refusing to seat me without cause," she said pointedly. "I'd like to hear why." At nearby tables, patrons shifted uncomfortably, whispering among themselves. A middle-aged man leaned toward his partner, their glances darting nervously between Alicia and Timothy. The murmurs grew as the tension thickened. Timothy's smirk turned sinister as he leaned closer. "Oh, you want a reason?" he sneered. "Fine, we have standards here, and, well, let's just say you don't exactly fit the atmosphere." The restaurant fell silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. A server near the kitchen froze, clutching a spotless glass as a sharp intake of breath betrayed their shock. "People like me," Alicia repeated, her tone firm yet daring him to clarify his insult. "Don't act like you don't know what I mean," Timothy shot back, his voice thick with condescension. "You're causing a scene. Maybe you'd be more comfortable at that fried chicken place down the road." Though anger simmered beneath the surface, Alicia refused to let it show. Her fingers tightened around her bag strap as she calmly surveyed the room, noting the eyes that now lingered on the unfolding drama. "I'd like your name," Alicia said, pulling her phone from her bag. With practiced ease, she began recording. "And I'd like you to repeat what you just said, for the record." For a moment, Timothy froze, his face tightening as if caught off guard. Then, with a sneer, he jabbed a finger at her phone. "You think you can scare me with that? Go ahead. Record. Post it wherever you want. People are tired of your kind always playing the victim." Gasps rippled through the room. A few patrons whispered to one another, their discomfort evident. An elderly woman muttered to her companion, "He's gone too far." Alicia kept her camera steady. "Just to be clear," she said calmly, "you're refusing to serve me because of people like me. Care to elaborate?" "You heard me," Timothy barked, his face reddening under the hat's brim, "and if you don't leave, I'll throw you out myself." Alicia's lips curled into a tight smile, her voice steady. "Thrown out for trying to eat? Or is there something more you'd like to add?" The air in the room grew thick with unease. A younger waiter hesitated nearby, unsure whether to step in. From the back office, Timothy's wife, Margaret, peeked out, her face pale as she surveyed the scene. "Get out!" Timothy bellowed, slamming his fist onto the podium. "You're not welcome here." "I'll leave," Alicia replied coolly, "when you explain why I'm not welcome here." Timothy's face twisted with rage. "That's it!" he shouted. "I'm calling the cops!" The room collectively held its breath as Alicia stood firm. "Go ahead," she said, lowering her phone slightly, but keeping it recording. "I'll wait." Alicia Brown stood firm, her phone steadily recording the scene as Timothy, visibly agitated, grappled with the weight of the public gaze. The tension in the room was tangible, the once vibrant conversations reduced to silence as patrons looked on. Timothy's smug demeanor began to crack, his confidence faltering under the weight of accountability. "You want to bring the law into this?" Timothy growled, his voice dropping into a sharp, almost guttural tone. His bravado, though still present, now carried a note of unease. "Fine. Let's see how that works out for you." He stormed toward the phone mounted on the wall, each step punctuated by the sharp echo of his polished shoes against the hardwood floor. The restaurant seemed to collectively hold its breath as Timothy snatched the receiver and began dialing. His hat's shadow veiled the growing anger on his face as he pressed the phone to his ear. "Hello, police?" he began, his tone adopting an exaggerated theatricality. "I've got a disturbance at Carter's Steakhouse. There's a woman here causing a scene and refusing to leave, even though I've asked her repeatedly." Alicia tilted her head slightly, her phone still raised. Her calm voice cut through the room, audible enough to challenge the narrative Timothy was attempting to weave. "Disruptive and aggressive?" she repeated, her words measured but sharp. She slowly panned her phone's camera, capturing the motionless patrons, their uneasy expressions betraying their discomfort, but not aligning with Timothy's claims. "Yeah, that's right," Timothy hissed into the phone, glancing toward Alicia with a glare. "She's filming me, trying to intimidate me. Send someone over immediately." He slammed the phone down, the sound reverberating through the silent room. Lowering the phone slightly, Alicia folded her arms and addressed him directly. "You just called the police on me because I asked to sit and eat," she said, her tone unwavering. "You're fully aware that this is harassment. You do know that, don't you?" Timothy let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Harassment? You're the one disrupting my business. Coming in here, making a scene, and now trying to turn it into some kind of sob story. Lady, you've got it all wrong." "No," Alicia replied, her voice slicing through the air like a knife. "You've refused me service because of my race, and now you're trying to weaponize law enforcement to intimidate me. That's not just harassment, it's illegal." For a moment, Timothy was silent, the color draining from his face. But before he could retort, a patron at one of the nearby tables, a middle-aged woman clutching a designer handbag, cautiously stood. "Excuse me," she began, her voice trembling, "but I've been sitting here watching this." "Mind your own business," Timothy barked, his tone so harsh that the woman flinched and sat back down, her lips pressed into a tight line. Alicia, undeterred, raised her voice slightly. "Actually, Timothy, you don't have the right to refuse service based on race. You operate a public establishment, which means you're subject to anti-discrimination laws. Or are you choosing to ignore that?" "Spare me the lecture," Timothy sneered, jabbing a finger in her direction. "You people always want to twist everything, always looking for a fight. It's pathetic." Alicia stepped closer, the phone still raised, her expression calm but unyielding. "And people like you think you can hide your prejudice behind policies and rules. But here's the reality. The law is clear, and your actions have consequences. Timothy's face reddened further, his voice dropping to a venomous hiss. Consequences? You don't scare me. People like me built this country, and you should be grateful you're even allowed through the door. A sharp gasp came from the back of the room. Margaret, Timothy's wife, had stepped into view, her face pale as she surveyed the scene. She opened her mouth as if to interject, but Timothy's glare silenced her. Alicia's voice broke through the tension. I think you've said enough, she stated, her tone firm but calm. You've made it abundantly clear who you are, and now everyone here knows it too. The faint sound of sirens grew louder, piercing the oppressive silence of the restaurant. Timothy's smugness returned momentarily as he folded his arms across his chest. Looks like your little game is about to backfire, he said, his voice oozing satisfaction. Alicia didn't flinch. We'll see, she replied simply. The restaurant's doors swung open, and a uniformed police officer entered, their gaze immediately scanning the room. Alicia turned to greet them, her phone still recording. Good afternoon, officer, she began, her voice steady. I'd like to report an incident of racial discrimination and harassment. Timothy's expression twisted into one of disbelief. You've got to be kidding me, he sputtered, his voice rising in pitch. His words faltered as the officer's eyes settled on him, their expression neutral but questioning. As the officer took a step forward, Alicia's resolve strengthened. Though her heart pounded, she stood firm, her voice unwavering. This was no longer just a confrontation. It was a battle for accountability and justice. The weight of the room's collective gaze bore down on Timothy as the reality of his actions began to sink in. Alicia Brown maintained her poise, her phone steadily capturing the chaos Timothy Carter had unleashed. His anger bubbled over, uncontrolled and glaringly public. The officer, now standing between the two, kept his expression neutral but alert. Timothy's outburst was loud enough to draw the attention of bystanders on the street, their curious and concerned gazes falling on the restaurant's entrance. What's going on here? Asked a woman passing by, her brow furrowed as she stopped to observe the escalating confrontation. Alicia remained silent for a moment, letting Timothy's loud, erratic movements and words paint the picture for anyone watching. Then, calmly and clearly, she responded, "This man just denied me service at his restaurant for no legitimate reason. Now he's trying to intimidate me for standing up for myself." "You're lying," Timothy spat, pointing an accusatory finger at Alicia. "You came in here looking for trouble, trying to play the victim to make me look bad." The officer raised a hand, his tone firm but even. "Sir, I need you to calm down. This situation is already being addressed, and further escalation won't help your case." Timothy's sneer deepened. "My case? This is my restaurant. I have the right to decide who I serve, and I've done nothing wrong." "That's not entirely accurate," the officer replied, his voice carrying a note of authority. "Refusing service based on race is against both state and federal law. Mrs. Brown has provided evidence suggesting that may be what happened here." The words hit Timothy like a blow, his body tensing as he looked toward Alicia, who stood unflinching, her phone still trained on him. "You think you can ruin me with this little stunt?" Timothy's voice rose to a near shout. "You won't get away with it." Alicia stepped forward slightly, her posture unyielding and her voice steady. "I don't need to ruin you, Timothy. You've done that yourself. All I did was ask for a table, and you decided that was too much for you to handle." The small crowd that had gathered outside grew, whispers circulating as onlookers pieced together the situation. A man in a business suit muttered to his companion, "It's 2025. You'd think people would know better by now." Timothy clenched his fists, his frustration boiling over as his words tumbled out in an incoherent mix of denial and outrage. "You think you're some kind of hero? You're nothing but a troublemaker, stirring the pot where it doesn't need stirring." The officer took a step closer to Timothy, his voice now tinged with warning. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice and step back. This is no longer a private matter. It's a legal one. Your behavior right now isn't helping." Alicia turned toward the officer, her voice calm but resolute. "Officer, I'd like to ensure that everything about this incident, including his threats and verbal harassment, is documented in your report. It's clear he doesn't understand the seriousness of his actions. Timothy's face contorted with rage, his mouth opening to retort, but Margaret appeared at the restaurant door, her face pale and strained. "Tim," she said softly, stepping forward with a trembling hand outstretched. "Please, just stop. You're making things worse." Timothy whipped around to face her, his voice cracking with frustration. "Worse? Margaret, this is my business, my reputation on the line. She's trying to destroy everything we've built." Margaret hesitated, her eyes flicking to Alicia, then to the officer. "Tim," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're the one destroying it." The tension hung heavy in the air as Timothy froze, his chest heaving with shallow breaths. Alicia, unmoved by his outburst, finally lowered her phone slightly and addressed the officer again. "I believe we're done here. I'll be following up on this matter through the proper legal channels." The officer nodded, handing her a card. "If you need any further assistance or have additional evidence to provide, don't hesitate to contact me." Alicia tucked the card into her bag and turned to leave, her stride purposeful as she walked away from the restaurant. Timothy's voice rose again behind her, shouting unintelligibly as Margaret gently tugged at his arm, pleading with him to calm down. As Alicia reached the corner, she stopped and turned back for a moment. The crowd outside Carter's steakhouse watched as Timothy's anger consumed him, the bold letters of his MAGA hat almost glowing under the setting sun. With a final glance, Alicia walked away, her phone still in hand and her resolve stronger than ever. Justice had only just begun to take root, and Alicia Brown was ready to see it through to the end. Alicia Brown stood unwavering, her phone still in hand, as the weight of Timothy Carter's threats hung in the air. She had faced men like him before, men who wielded their power and privilege like weapons, hoping intimidation would silence opposition. But Alicia's resolve only grew stronger. She had no intention of backing down. "Sir, I've said everything I need to," Alicia replied, her voice even but firm. "I suggest you do the same before this situation spirals further out of your control." Timothy stepped closer, his looming frame casting a shadow over her. His voice dropped to a threatening growl, dripping with malice. "You don't scare me, lady. Your videos, your complaints, your so-called rights, none of it matters. People like you always think you can come in here, push us around, and get away with it. But let me tell you something. You're in my town now, and you don't belong here." The officer, positioned nearby, cleared his throat, his tone stern. "Mr. Carter, that's enough. I suggest you step back and calm down. This isn't helping your case." Timothy ignored the officer's warning, his focus locked on Alicia. "You think you're so smart, don't you? Coming in here, acting high and mighty, looking down on us like we're nothing. You have no idea who you're messing with." Alicia's eyes narrowed, her voice unyielding. "Oh, I know exactly who I'm dealing with. A man too afraid to face the truth. A man who hides his smallness behind his privilege and ignorance." Her words hit like a hammer. Timothy's hand twitched, as if he wanted to act on his rage, but before he could, the officer stepped between them, his voice firm and commanding. "That's enough, Mr. Carter. Back off, now." Timothy's hand dropped, but his anger remained, spilling out in venomous words. "You'd better watch yourself," he spat, pointing a shaking finger at Alicia. "People like you always push too far. One day, you'll get what's coming to you." A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion. Bystanders exchanged glances, their faces a mix of disgust and disbelief. Alicia took note of their reactions, but kept her focus squarely on Timothy. "Is that a threat?" she asked, her tone sharp and cutting. Timothy hesitated, his bluster faltering for a moment. Then, regaining his footing, he sneered. "It's not a threat. It's a fact. People like you think you're untouchable, but let's see how long that lasts when this town turns its back on you." The officer took a step closer to Timothy, his voice sterner now. "Mr. Carter, this is your final warning. Any further aggression, and I'll have to take action." Timothy threw his hands in the air, his laugh bitter and scornful. "Oh, of course. Take her side. Like everyone else. This is what's wrong with this country. catering to people like her, while hard-working folks like me get trampled on. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, a few people shaking their heads in disbelief. One young woman in athletic wear pulled out her phone and began recording. "Unbelievable," she muttered, capturing Timothy's every move. Alicia's voice remained calm, slicing through the noise. "You're digging your own grave, Timothy. And now, everyone here sees exactly who you are. You can't hide behind your money, your restaurant, or your slogans anymore." Timothy's fists clenched at his sides, his face twisting with rage. The officer stepped even closer, his hand resting near his belt. "Mr. Carter, leave now, or I'll have to detain you. This is your final chance." Timothy glared at the officer, then at Alicia. Finally, with a sneer, he stepped back, his chest heaving. He jabbed a finger in Alicia's direction. "This isn't over," he growled before storming back into the restaurant and slamming the door behind him. As the door closed, the tension in the air seemed to ease slightly. The small crowd began to disperse, their murmurs fading into the background. The young woman with the phone approached Alicia, her expression apologetic. "I got the whole thing," she said. "If you need another video for your case, I can send it to you." "Thank you," Alicia replied, offering a small but sincere smile. The officer turned to Alicia, his demeanor softening. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm fine," Alicia answered, her voice steady once more. "I've dealt with people like him before, but this time I'm making sure he faces the consequences." The officer nodded, his tone professional. "If you need to add anything to your complaint or need further assistance, don't hesitate to contact me. And be careful. He seems unstable." "Thank you, officer," Alicia said, tucking his card into her purse. As she walked away, the weight of the confrontation settled over her, but it brought no fear, only determination. Timothy's threats had solidified her resolve. This was no longer just about her. It was about standing up against systemic prejudice and ensuring justice prevailed. The next morning, Alicia sat in the office of Rachel Collins, a sharp-eyed attorney known for her expertise in discrimination cases. The sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating stacks of legal textbooks and case files on Rachel's desk. Rachel leaned forward, watching the video on Alicia's phone with rapt attention. Timothy's red-faced tirade echoed through the room, his words unambiguously prejudiced. "This is as clear-cut as it gets," Rachel said, pausing the video. "Blatant racial discrimination, verbal harassment, and even a clear threat. He's given us everything we need to make this case airtight." Alicia crossed her arms, her expression resolute. "I don't just want damages. I want to ensure he can't treat anyone else like this again." Rachel nodded, jotting notes on a legal pad. "We'll start with the State Human Rights Commission. That will trigger an official investigation and put his business under scrutiny immediately. Once that's in motion, we'll prepare a civil lawsuit. If he has any sense, he'll settle. But I doubt someone like him will." "He won't," Alicia replied, her tone firm. "He's too arrogant, but I'm ready to fight." Rachel set her pen down and folded her hands. "We'll also pursue punitive damages. This isn't just about compensating you. It's about ensuring he feels the weight of his actions and sending a message to others like him." "Good," Alicia said, her voice unwavering. "He's been getting away with this for far too long." Rachel studied Alicia closely. "This won't be easy. People like Timothy Carter often dig in their heels when faced with accountability." "That's fine," Alicia replied. "I'm not backing down." Rachel Collins studied Alicia for a moment, her sharp eyes narrowing as she measured her resolve. "People like Timothy Carter thrive on playing the victim when their actions are exposed. Are you ready for the scrutiny this fight will bring?" Alicia met her gaze, unflinching. "I've faced worse. This isn't just about me. It's about standing up for everyone who's been made to feel like they don't belong. I won't back down." Rachel allowed herself a faint smile and slid a document across the desk. "Then, let's get started." At Carter's Steakhouse, Timothy Carter sat in his office, his knuckles white as they gripped the arms of his leather chair. The restaurant, once his pride and joy, now felt like a prison. Its luxurious decor and polished walls couldn't shield him from the relentless storm raging outside. His laptop screen glowed with an endless stream of venomous comments and scathing reviews, each one a nail in the coffin of his reputation. Racist establishment, one review read. Boycott this place, demanded another. Shut this place down. The restaurant's phone rang incessantly, the shrill sound adding to Timothy's boiling frustration. Every call was either a complaint, a cancellation, or worse, a threat. With a growl, he slammed the laptop shut, muttering curses under his breath. Margaret appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed, exhaustion etched into her face. Tim? This isn't going away. People are canceling reservations, and the staff is asking if we'll even make payroll next month. Timothy turned to her, his face flushed with anger. You think I'm going to apologize? Grovel to her? Admit I did something wrong? Margaret stepped further into the office, her voice soft but firm. I think you need to start thinking about what's best for this business. For us. You don't have to admit anything. Just make a statement. Something neutral, to calm people down. I'm not apologizing, Timothy snapped, his voice rising. She came in here looking for trouble, and now she's trying to ruin us. This is all on her. Margaret's lips tightened, but she didn't back down. Maybe you should take a good look at yourself, Tim. You didn't have to humiliate her like that. You could have just treated her like any other customer. But you didn't, and now we're paying the price. I treated her exactly how she deserved to be treated, Timothy growled, slamming his fist on the desk. This is my restaurant, and no one tells me how to run it. Margaret shook her head slowly, her voice quieter, but no less resolute. You're too proud to see what's happening. You're digging our grave, Tim. Timothy turned back to the window, glaring at the protesters gathered outside. Their signs read, "Racism has no place here," and "Justice for Alicia," their chants growing louder with every passing moment. Let them protest, Timothy muttered, disdain dripping from his words. They'll get bored and move on. They always do. But deep down, Margaret knew better. She could see the writing on the wall, even if Timothy refused to. That evening, Alicia sat on her couch, her laptop open as a flood of messages poured into her inbox. The video had gone viral, shared by local news outlets, activists, and even national platforms. The comments, though overwhelming, only fueled her determination. Thank you for standing up, one message read. We need more people like you. I'm so sorry you went through this, another said. Stay strong. You're making a difference. Alicia scrolled through the messages, her resolve solidifying with each word of encouragement. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was a fight for every person who had ever been silenced, humiliated, or made to feel like they didn't belong. She closed her laptop and leaned back, her mind racing with the road ahead. Timothy Carter had underestimated her. He thought he could intimidate her into silence and escape unscathed. But now, he was about to learn what it meant to face real consequences. The protests outside Carter's steakhouse swelled with each passing day. What had started as a handful of demonstrators had grown into a massive crowd, spilling onto the nearby sidewalks. Their chants echoed through the streets, audible from blocks away. Signs painted with bold letters declared "Racism ends here" and "Justice for Alicia," waving high above the heads of locals, activists, and curious onlookers. Timothy stood at his office window, his jaw clenched as he watched the growing crowd. The restaurant's once thriving business had dwindled to a trickle of die-hard loyalists, but even they glanced nervously over their shoulders, wary of being associated with him. Tim, you can't ignore this anymore, Margaret said, breaking the tense silence. Her tone was a mix of urgency and exhaustion. She stood in the doorway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. This isn't just bad PR. It's a disaster. We're hemorrhaging money. Timothy didn't turn away from the window. His fingers tapped a restless rhythm on the windowsill as he muttered, I'm not giving in to them. You're not giving in? Margaret snapped, her voice rising. You're not giving in, but you're also not doing anything. The phone won't stop ringing with complaints. The staff is panicking, and half our suppliers are threatening to cut ties. Finally, Timothy turned to face her, his expression hard. So what do you want me to do, Margaret? Crawl to that woman and beg for forgiveness? Admit I did something wrong when I didn't? Margaret threw her hands up in frustration. I want you to save what's left of this business before there's nothing left to save. Timothy's sneer deepened. They'll get bored, he said. gesturing toward the protesters outside. They always do. The media will find another story, and this will blow over. Margaret stepped closer, her voice firm. Look outside, Tim. Does that look like it's blowing over to you? Timothy didn't answer. He turned back to the window, his fists tightening as he stared at the swelling crowd. Below, Alicia stood among the protesters, her presence a quiet but powerful reminder that this fight was far from over. The energy of the crowd surged as Alicia stood among the protesters, her phone capturing the scene around her. The chants and raised voices, once a stark contrast to the isolation she felt during her confrontation with Timothy Carter, now filled her with a sense of unity. She wasn't alone anymore. This fight belonged to everyone. As she scanned the crowd, Alicia spotted Angela Martin, a local journalist known for her thoughtful reporting, weaving her way through with a microphone in hand. Angela's eyes brightened when she saw Alicia and waved her over. "Alicia Brown?" Angela called, her voice warm yet professional. "That's me," Alicia replied, her voice steady despite the intensity of the moment. Angela gestured toward her camera crew, who quickly adjusted their equipment. "Would you mind giving us a statement? Your story has resonated with so many people, and they want to hear directly from you." Alicia hesitated briefly, the weight of her words settling on her. Then, with a resolute nod, she stepped into the frame, the chants of the protesters forming a rhythmic backdrop. "Alicia," Angela began, raising her microphone, "your video of the incident at Carter's Steakhouse has gone viral, sparking protests and widespread backlash against the restaurant. Can you tell us why you decided to take a stand?" Alicia's voice was calm, but filled with conviction. "I took a stand because what happened wasn't just wrong. It was illegal. No one should be treated differently because of their race, especially in a place that claims to welcome the public. This fight isn't just about me. It's about accountability and ensuring no one else has to endure what I did." Angela nodded thoughtfully. "What do you hope to achieve with this fight?" "I want accountability," Alicia replied firmly, her gaze unwavering. "Not just from Timothy Carter, but from anyone who enables this kind of behavior. And I want people to know that they have the right to stand up against discrimination, no matter where it happens." Angela smiled faintly as she lowered her microphone. "Thank you, Alicia. Your courage is inspiring to so many." As the interview concluded, Alicia felt a light tap on her shoulder. She turned to see a young woman holding a handmade sign that read, "Your fight is our fight." The woman's face was flushed with emotion, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Thank you for doing this," she said, her words carrying a mix of gratitude and pain. "My mom went through something like this a few years ago, but she didn't have the strength to fight back. Seeing you stand up, it means everything." Alicia smiled, her chest tightening with emotion. "Thank you," she said softly. "It means a lot to hear that." The young woman nodded and stepped back into the crowd, raising her sign high above her head. Alicia turned back toward the restaurant, her gaze locking on Timothy's silhouette in the window. He was watching her, but this time she didn't feel the weight of his anger. Instead, she felt her own strength and the collective power of everyone standing with her. That evening, Timothy sat alone in his office, the faint chants of the protesters outside seeping through the walls. His hands trembled as he reopened his laptop, bracing himself for the relentless storm of online backlash. The restaurant's social media page was flooded with furious comments, each one sharper than the last. "Racist establishment," one read. "Apologize and step down. It's your only chance," demanded another. Timothy slammed the laptop shut, his chest heaving with frustration. His world was crumbling around him, but his pride wouldn't let him bend. Margaret appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression both tired and stern. "Tim, you can't ignore this anymore," she said, her voice tinged with urgency. "The staff is scared. We're losing business, and if this keeps up, there won't be anything left to save." Timothy's face twisted with anger. "You think I'm going to crawl to that woman and beg for forgiveness? Admit I did something wrong? I didn't do anything wrong." Margaret stepped into the room, her voice firm but softer now. "This isn't about pride, Tim. It's about survival. If you don't do something to fix this, We're finished." He glared at her, his voice rising. "I won't give in. Let them protest. Let them shout. They'll get bored eventually. They always do." Margaret shook her head, her frustration boiling over. "Look outside, Tim. Does that look like it's going away? Every day the crowd grows bigger. And every day, your silence digs us deeper into a hole." Timothy turned back to the window, his fists clenched. Below, the protesters had swelled in number, their chants louder than ever. Signs reading, "Racism ends here," and "Justice for Alicia," waved high above the crowd. Among them, Alicia stood firm, her presence radiating determination. The fifth day of protests marked a turning point. The crowd outside Carter's steakhouse spilled into the streets, their chants drowning out the noise of passing cars. News crews lined the sidewalks, capturing every moment of the standoff. Inside the empty restaurant, Timothy's patience snapped. "Enough!" he roared, slamming his fist against the podium. Without a second thought, he stormed toward the front door, Margaret trailing behind him. "Tim, don't!" she called, her voice filled with panic. "This isn't going to help." He ignored her, shoving the door open with such force it banged against the brick wall. The crowd turned at the noise, their chants fading briefly as they spotted him. His red MAGA hat gleamed in the evening sunlight, a stark symbol of defiance. "You think this is funny?" Timothy shouted, stepping forward, his voice cracking with rage. "You think you can stand out here waving your signs and destroy me? You're nothing but freeloaders with too much time on your hands." The crowd erupted in response, their chants swelling in unison. "Shut it down! Shut it down!" Timothy's face reddened further as he stomped toward a young protester holding a sign that read, "Justice for Alicia." "You think you're a hero?" Timothy snarled. "You don't know anything about me or my business. You're just part of the mob." The young man held his ground, his phone raised to capture Timothy's tirade. "The whole world knows what you are," he replied, his voice calm but resolute. Timothy snapped, his hand jerking forward as if to grab the phone. The young man flinched, but didn't back down, his gaze steady. "Get back!" another protester shouted, stepping between Timothy and the young man. She was a middle-aged woman with a determined expression. "You can't intimidate us." "I'm not trying to intimidate you," Timothy bellowed, his voice shaking with rage. "I'm trying," but his words were drowned out by the crowd, their chants rising louder than ever. Timothy, consumed by his own anger, didn't realize that every step he took toward confrontation was only sealing his fate. The protesters' chants reached a deafening crescendo as Timothy Carter, his face red with rage, attempted to assert control. His arms flailed in frustration as he turned in a circle, shouting over the crowd. "You don't understand," he bellowed, his voice cracking. "She came in here looking for trouble. She wanted this to happen. She wanted me to refuse her service." A young man holding a phone shook his head in disbelief, still recording every moment. "She wanted you to insult her, threaten her, and call the cops on her? That's what you think? You don't know what it's like," Timothy roared, his desperation spilling out in jagged edges. "You don't know what it's like to work hard your whole life, to build something from nothing, only to have it torn apart by people who don't belong here." The air seemed to freeze for a moment as his words hung, sharp and cutting. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, the weight of his statement sinking in. "Don't belong here?" someone shouted from the back. "What the hell does that mean?" another voice demanded. Timothy realized his mistake too late. His mouth opened and closed, but no explanation came. The crowd surged forward, their chants turning angrier. "Racist!" someone yelled. "Apologize!" another shouted. Soon, the unified cry of "Apologize! Apologize!" rose like a tidal wave. Margaret pushed her way through the doorway, grabbing Timothy's arm. "Tim, stop!" she hissed. "You're making it worse." He yanked his arm away, glaring at her. "I'm not apologizing to these people," he snapped, his voice trembling with defiance. "I didn't do anything wrong." Nearby, police officers stepped forward, their hands hovering near their belts. One raised a hand, his voice firm. "Everyone, let's keep this peaceful." The crowd pulled back slightly, their chants losing a bit of their edge, but not their intensity. Timothy stood frozen for a moment, his chest heaving with exertion and anger, before storming back into the restaurant. Margaret followed, her face pale with frustration. Inside, Timothy slammed the door shut, leaning against it as his breaths came in short, ragged gasps. "They don't get to win," he muttered, more to himself than to Margaret. "They don't get to ruin me." Margaret crossed her arms, her expression cold. "You've already ruined yourself, Tim," she said softly, before walking away, leaving him alone with his crumbling empire. In the days leading up to the court proceedings, Rachel Collins's office had transformed into a strategic headquarters. Legal documents, case files, and notes were spread across the large conference table, each piece of evidence meticulously reviewed and catalogued. Alicia sat at the far end, her laptop open as she rewatched the videos. Every word Timothy had shouted, every venomous sneer, and every threat replayed in her mind like a bad memory. Rachel paced the room, her legal pad in hand as she outlined their strategy. "The videos are our strongest weapon," she said, glancing at Alicia. "They show everything. His refusal to serve you, his verbal abuse, and even his threats. The Human Rights Commission will weigh that heavily." Alicia nodded, her jaw tight. "What about his finances? You said you subpoenaed his records." Rachel smirked, her tone sharp. "We did, and they paint a grim picture. The restaurant has been in decline for years. This lawsuit, combined with the protests and bad press, could be the final nail in the coffin." "Good," Alicia replied firmly. "He needs to feel the full weight of this." Rachel stopped pacing and leaned on the table. "We're also bringing in former employees to testify. Several have come forward with stories about Timothy's discriminatory behavior, refusing to hire minorities, using racial slurs in the kitchen, and creating a hostile work environment. Their testimonies will show this isn't just one incident, it's a pattern." Alicia's eyes narrowed. "Do you think he'll try to settle before this goes to court?" Rachel tilted her head thoughtfully. "He might, but knowing him, I doubt it. Men like Timothy thrive on their pride. They'd rather burn everything to the ground than admit they were wrong." "Then we'll be ready," Alicia said, her determination evident. Across town, Timothy sat in his office, glaring at his attorney. The younger man, clean-cut and visibly uncomfortable, shuffled his notes under Timothy's intense stare. "So, what are my options?" Timothy demanded, his voice sharp and impatient. The attorney cleared his throat, his tone measured. "Mr. Carter, the evidence against you is overwhelming. The videos alone are damning, not to mention the witnesses who have come forward. I strongly recommend you settle this case before it goes to trial." Timothy slammed his fist on the desk, causing the attorney to flinch. "Settle? Are you kidding me? That would be admitting I did something wrong." The attorney sighed, choosing his words carefully. "With all due respect, Mr. Carter, you did do something wrong. You refused service to a customer based on her race. That's illegal. If this goes to trial, you'll lose, and the damages could bankrupt you." Timothy leaned back in his chair, his face flushed with anger. "I don't care about the money," he growled. "This is about my reputation. If I settle, everyone will think I'm a coward." "Right now, your reputation is already in tatters," the attorney replied bluntly. "You've become a national example of discrimination. Settling could help you save face and minimize the damage." Timothy's eyes burned with defiance. "No, I'm not backing down. Let her come after me. Let them all come after me. I'm not admitting to anything." The attorney sighed again, gathering his notes. "Then I'll prepare for trial. But you need to understand, the odds are not in your favor." The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Darren Williams sat on the witness stand, his fingers nervously clasped together. His eyes darted to Timothy Carter, whose glare was sharp enough to cut through steel. Darren swallowed hard, but when Rachel Collins offered him a reassuring nod, he steadied himself. "Did you ever hear Mr. Carter use racially charged language during your time at Carter's Steakhouse?" Rachel asked, her tone calm but direct. Darren hesitated for a moment, his gaze briefly flicking toward Timothy before nodding. "Yes, I did," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "He would use slurs in the kitchen when he thought no one was listening. He called me lazy more times than I can count. And it wasn't just me. He'd make comments about other employees, too, especially those who weren't white." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. The jury exchanged glances, some visibly uncomfortable with what they were hearing. Rachel let the weight of Darren's words settle before continuing. "Can you recall a specific instance?" she pressed. Darren nodded slowly. "One time, I was cleaning up after a shift, and Mr. Carter came into the kitchen. He saw I wasn't finished yet and said, 'Typical, can't expect much from people like you.' I knew what he meant. Everyone in the room did." Rachel's expression remained neutral, but her voice carried a hint of steel as she asked, "And how did that make you feel?" Darren's hands tightened around each other. "It made me feel small, like I didn't matter, like no matter how hard I worked, I'd never be good enough for him." Rachel turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, Darren Williams's experience is not an isolated case. It's part of a pattern, a consistent and deliberate attempt by Mr. Carter to demean and discriminate against his employees and customers based on race." Timothy's lawyer shot to his feet, his voice sharp. "Objection! Speculation! And leading the witness." The judge raised a hand, his face stern. "Sustained. Ms. Collins, stick to the facts." Rachel nodded, her composure unshaken. "No further questions, Your Honor." As Darren stepped down, Rachel called the second former employee to the stand. The young man, visibly more confident than Darren, adjusted his tie as he took his seat. His name, Tony Ramirez, was given for the record, and Rachel wasted no time. "Mr. Ramirez, can you describe your experience working for Mr. Carter?" Tony leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. "I worked there for about 2 years. It was clear from the start that he treated certain employees differently. When I asked for a raise after a year of solid performance, he laughed and told me I should just be grateful he hired me in the first place." Rachel nodded. "Did you ever witness discriminatory behavior toward customers?" Tony's face hardened. "Yes. One time, a group of black teenagers came in after school. They weren't causing any trouble, just waiting for a table. Mr. Carter told me to tell them we were full, even though half the restaurant was empty. When I asked why, he said, 'We don't need their kind hanging around.'" The courtroom erupted in whispers. Timothy's lawyer quickly stood again, his face flushed. "Objection, Your Honor. This is prejudicial." The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack. "Overruled. The testimony is relevant to the case." Rachel glanced at Tony. "And how did that make you feel, Mr. Ramirez?" Tony's jaw tightened. "Angry, disgusted, like I was being forced to be part of something I didn't believe in." Rachel nodded, turning back to the jury. "Once again, we see a consistent pattern of discriminatory behavior. This isn't a misunderstanding. It's a culture created and perpetuated by Mr. Carter." As Tony left the stand, Alicia's heart raced. Each testimony bolstered her case, but also brought her closer to reliving the humiliation she endured. The courtroom's attention shifted as Rachel Collins called her to the stand. Alicia rose, her back straight and her expression resolute, and walked to the witness chair. Rachel approached her with a gentle tone. "Ms. Brown, can you describe what happened when you entered Carter's Steakhouse on the day in question?" Alicia took a deep breath, her voice clear. "I walked in expecting to have lunch. The dining room was mostly empty, so I didn't think there would be an issue. But the moment I spoke to Mr. Carter, his tone made it clear that I wasn't welcome. He said they were full and refused to seat me, even though there were open tables in plain sight." Rachel nodded. "And how did you respond?" "I pointed out the empty tables and asked if there was another reason I couldn't be seated," Alicia continued, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. "That's when he said, 'People like you don't fit in here.' He told me to try somewhere more casual, like a fried chicken place down the road." The jury shifted uncomfortably, and the reporters scribbled furiously. Rachel let the silence stretch for a moment before asking, "How did that make you feel?" Alicia's voice wavered slightly, but remained strong. "It was humiliating. I've dealt with prejudice before, but this was different. It was public, blatant, and demeaning. And when I refused to leave, he called the police, trying to intimidate me further." Rachel placed her hands on the podium, addressing the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, Alicia Brown's experience is one of many. This is about more than just one incident. It's about holding Mr. Carter accountable for years of unchecked discrimination." Timothy shifted in his seat, his jaw tight. His lawyer leaned over, whispering something, but Timothy waved him off again, his glare fixed on Alicia. As Rachel returned to her seat, Alicia felt a surge of relief, but also anticipation. The truth was out in the open now, and there was no turning back. The courtroom was no longer just a stage for legal arguments. It was a battleground for justice. The courtroom was silent, save for the faint scratch of pens on notepads, as reporters documented every word. Alicia's unwavering demeanor and sharp responses had cornered Timothy's lawyer, who now struggled to maintain his composure. The lawyer adjusted his tie, his voice losing some of its earlier sharpness. "Ms. Brown," he began, trying to regain control, "is it possible that you misinterpreted my client's words, that perhaps his comments were taken out of context?" Alicia's gaze was steady, her voice firm but calm. "No, it's not possible." His words were clear, deliberate, and targeted. "He didn't just refuse me service, he made it a point to humiliate me in front of everyone. There was no room for misinterpretation." The lawyer's expression hardened, his pacing quickening as he addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is a case of miscommunication blown out of proportion. My client, Mr. Carter, is a hard-working businessman. He may have used poor judgment in the heat of the moment, but that does not make him a racist or guilty of the accusations being made." Rachel Collins immediately stood. "Objection, Your Honor. The defense is making an unsupported statement." "Sustained," the judge said, giving Timothy's lawyer a warning glance. "Stick to questions, counsel." The lawyer pressed his lips into a thin line before turning back to Alicia. "Ms. Brown, you've made bold accusations against my client. Isn't it true that you've gained significant attention and support because of this incident?" Alicia tilted her head slightly, her voice cool and measured. "Yes, it's true that the incident has drawn attention. But let me make one thing clear. I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't ask to be humiliated, recorded, or made into a symbol. All I wanted was to have a meal in peace. The attention came because people recognized the injustice of what happened." The lawyer's smirk faltered as he tried a new angle. "And isn't it also true that by staying in the restaurant and recording the interaction, you escalated the situation unnecessarily?" Alicia leaned forward slightly, her words cutting through the courtroom's stillness like a blade. "I didn't escalate the situation. I stood my ground, because I have the right to exist in public spaces without being told I don't belong. Recording the interaction wasn't about provocation, it was about protection. If I hadn't recorded it, we wouldn't even be here today, because my voice alone wouldn't have been enough." "Oh," the lawyer faltered, momentarily silenced by the clarity of Alicia's response. He turned to the jury, attempting one last appeal. "Ladies and gentlemen, my client may have made mistakes, but he is not the villain he's being portrayed as. Everyone makes errors in judgment under stress. Surely we can't condemn a man for one lapse." Alicia's voice rose slightly, steady, and filled with conviction. This wasn't a lapse. It wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate, unapologetic discrimination. And if we let this go unchecked, we send the message that it's okay to treat people differently based on the color of their skin. That's not a message I'm willing to accept." The lawyer opened his mouth as if to respond, but the judge cut him off. "That's enough, counsel. Return to your seat." The lawyer hesitated, then nodded curtly and walked back to the defense table, his face tight with frustration. Rachel stood again, addressing the jury with calm precision. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you've heard today isn't just testimony. It's evidence of a pattern of behavior that is illegal, immoral, and inexcusable. Alicia Brown didn't come here seeking fame or attention. She came here seeking justice, not just for herself, but for everyone who has ever been told they don't belong." She paused, letting her words resonate in the quiet room. "This case isn't just about one person or one restaurant. It's about holding people accountable for their actions and sending a message that discrimination has no place in our society." As Rachel sat down, the judge dismissed the court for the day. Alicia rose from the witness stand, her step steady and deliberate as she returned to her seat. The tension in the room remained thick as reporters scribbled their notes and whispered among themselves. Timothy sat stiffly in his chair, his jaw tight, while his lawyer avoided meeting his gaze. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered once again, their chants echoing in the air. Alicia stepped out, the sunlight catching her determined expression as cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. She ignored them, her focus unwavering. This wasn't about spectacle. It was about justice. Timothy's lawyer leaned in, his tone sharp and accusatory. "Mr. Williams, you've already admitted you were fired for being late multiple times. Isn't it possible that your testimony is driven by bitterness or a personal grudge against my client?" Darren's hands tightened in his lap, but his voice remained steady. "I was late once, and I apologized for it. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because of how I and others were treated." The lawyer smirked, pacing before the jury. "So you claim, but isn't it convenient that your sudden desire to speak out comes now, during a high-profile trial?" Darren straightened in his chair, his voice firm. "Convenient? No. Necessary. I stayed quiet for too long because I needed that job. I'm here now because what Mr. Carter did to me and others was wrong, and it's time someone said it out loud." The lawyer's smirk faltered, but he pressed on. "Mr. Williams, you said earlier that Mr. Carter used slurs and made jokes. Did you record any of these alleged incidents?" Darren shook his head. "No, but that doesn't make them any less true." The lawyer seized on his response. "So we're just supposed to take your word for it? No evidence? No proof? Just your accusations?" Darren met the lawyer's gaze evenly. "My word, and the words of others who've experienced the same thing. Are you saying all of us are lying?" The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, prompting the judge to rap his gavel. "Order in the court!" The lawyer turned to the jury, his tone shifting to one of calculated skepticism. "Ladies and gentlemen, consider this carefully. We have a former employee, fired for poor performance, making serious accusations without a shred of physical evidence to back them up. Ask yourselves, how credible is this testimony?" Rachel stood abruptly. "Objection, Your Honor. The defense is attempting to discredit the witness without basis." "Sustained," the judge said, his tone firm. "Counselor, move on." Timothy's lawyer sighed, his frustration evident, and turned back to Darren. No further questions. As Darren stepped down, the tension in the room was palpable. Rachel rose smoothly, addressing the court. "Your Honor, we'd like to rest our case." The judge nodded. "Very well. We'll reconvene tomorrow for closing arguments. Court is adjourned." The sound of the gavel echoed through the courtroom as the judge stood, signaling the end of the day's proceedings. Alicia exhaled slowly, her hands still trembling slightly as she gathered her belongings. Rachel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You did well today," she said softly. "The jury heard your story, and they saw the truth." Across the room, Timothy Carter leaned toward his lawyer, his face a mixture of anger and fear. "We're not done yet," he hissed, his voice low but venomous. As the courtroom emptied, reporters swarmed outside, their cameras and microphones poised. Alicia stepped into the sunlight, the chants of protesters outside Carter's steakhouse still echoing in her mind. She stood tall, her resolve unshaken. Justice was within reach, and she was determined to see it through. The courtroom buzzed with energy as the verdict settled over everyone present. Alicia stood, her legs trembling slightly, but her resolve stronger than ever. The jury's decision echoed in her mind, guilty of racial discrimination and harassment. For the first time in weeks, the weight on her chest began to lift. Rachel placed a steadying hand on Alicia's shoulder. "We did it," she repeated softly, her voice laced with pride. Alicia nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Timothy Carter stormed out of the courtroom, his steps heavy and his face pale. His lawyer followed behind him, muttering quietly, but Timothy ignored him, his fury palpable. His once confident demeanor had crumbled under the weight of the trial, leaving only a hollow shell of defiance. Margaret Carter remained seated in the gallery, her head lowered. She didn't chase after her husband, her expression unreadable as she stared at the table before her. The soft murmurs of the crowd seemed to swirl around her, but she didn't move. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd of supporters and protesters had gathered. As Alicia stepped out, a cheer erupted, their voices ringing with vindication and hope. Signs reading "Justice for Alicia" and "No Room for Racism" waved high above the crowd. Cameras flashed, and reporters swarmed toward her, microphones thrust forward as they shouted questions. Alicia raised her hand for silence, her voice calm but strong as she spoke. "Today is not just about me. It's about standing up to discrimination and saying, 'Enough is enough.' This verdict sends a message that no one is above accountability. I hope it inspires others to stand up for what is right, no matter how hard the fight may seem." The crowd cheered louder, their energy palpable. A young woman stepped forward, holding a sign that read, "Your fight is our fight." Her voice trembled with emotion as she said, "Thank you, Alicia. What you did today means everything." Alicia smiled warmly, her eyes glistening. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady. "This is a victory for all of us." Back inside the courthouse, Rachel packed up her files, a faint smile playing on her lips. "This isn't just a win for you," she said, her tone serious. "This sets a precedent. Timothy Carter, and people like him, will think twice before they act this way again." Alicia nodded, her determination unwavering. "It's a step forward, but the fight isn't over. There's still so much work to be done." Rachel extended a hand, and Alicia shook it firmly. "You're ready for it," Rachel said, "and you won't be fighting alone." Across town, Carter's Steakhouse stood silent, its once bustling dining room now empty. The verdict had spread quickly, and the protests outside had grown in size and fervor. The signs were no longer just about Alicia. They carried messages of unity, equality, and justice. Inside, Timothy sat alone in his office, his head in his hands. The weight of the verdict, the financial damages, and the mandatory training ordered by the court bore down on him like an anchor. His world had shrunk to this, his reputation shattered, his business teetering on the brink of collapse. Yet his pride, even in defeat, refused to let him acknowledge the truth. That evening, Alicia returned home, the quiet of her apartment a stark contrast to the noise of the courthouse. She set her bag down and sank onto the couch, exhaustion washing over her. As she opened her laptop, messages of support poured in from all over the country. "You've given us hope," one message read. "Thank you for standing up for all of us," said another. Alicia smiled, her heart swelling with a mix of gratitude and responsibility. She knew this victory was just one chapter in a much larger story, but for now, it was enough. She leaned back, closing her eyes as the events of the day replayed in her mind. Justice had been served, and a message had been sent. The fight wasn't over, but she was ready for whatever came next. She had come to realize the fight was about so much more. It was about standing up for countless others who had endured humiliation, discrimination, and silence. Alicia wiped her eyes and took a deep breath, her resolve solidifying. This victory wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a broader fight for equality and accountability. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in a warm glow. Across town, Carter's Steakhouse stood as a hollow reminder of Timothy Carter's downfall. The once bustling establishment was now dark and deserted, its windows reflecting a lonely emptiness. Timothy sat slumped at the bar, a glass of untouched water in front of him. Margaret watched from the doorway, her expression a mix of frustration and pity. "Tim," she said softly, stepping forward, "it's time to move on. You can't change what happened, but you can decide what you do next." Timothy didn't respond. He stared at the bar, his mind replaying the trial, the protests, the humiliating verdict. His voice was barely audible as he muttered, "I didn't mean for it to end like this." Margaret sighed, placing a hand on the bar. "Maybe not, but your choices brought you here. It's time to take responsibility." Timothy's shoulders sagged further, the weight of her words sinking in. For the first time, he didn't argue. He simply nodded, a small gesture of acknowledgement that the man he once was could no longer exist in the world he had created. At her apartment, Alicia stood on her balcony, the cool evening breeze brushing against her face. Below, the city buzzed with life, but her mind was on the journey that had brought her here. The messages on her phone reminded her that her fight had resonated far beyond the walls of the courtroom. She opened her laptop and began typing a post for her social media accounts. Today's verdict is a victory, not just for me, but for everyone who has ever been told they don't belong. This fight wasn't easy, and at times it felt overwhelming, but it was necessary. Discrimination thrives in silence, and I refuse to stay silent. Thank you to everyone who supported me, stood by me, and believed in justice. This is just the beginning. Together, we can create a world where everyone is treated with the respect and dignity they deserve. The fight continues. She hit post, her message quickly gathering likes, shares, and comments of solidarity. Alicia smiled, a quiet sense of accomplishment settling over her. This was her purpose now, to use her voice not just for herself, but for others who couldn't yet find theirs. As the city lights sparkled in the distance, Alicia felt a renewed sense of hope. Her journey had shown her the strength in unity, the power of resilience, and the importance of fighting for what's right. And though the battle wasn't over, she knew she was ready for whatever came next. Justice had been served, and Alicia Brown was just getting started. As Alicia reflected on her journey over a quiet cup of coffee with Rachel, the weight of her victory began to settle into something deeper. The courtroom win was more than just a personal triumph. It was a spark igniting change. Across the city and beyond, people were talking about the case, its implications, and the courage it took to stand up. "What happens now?" Alicia asked, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. The warm sunlight streaming through the cafe window painted soft shadows on the table. Rachel leaned back, a knowing smile playing on her lips. "Carter's Steakhouse will face mandatory anti-discrimination oversight, though honestly, I don't think it'll survive much longer. His reputation is in tatters, and the damages he owes you are likely the final nail in the coffin." Alicia nodded, her expression contemplative. "It's not just about him," she said softly. "It's about what this case stands for. If it helps others feel like they can stand up, then it was worth it." Rachel raised her coffee cup in a small toast to making a difference. Alicia returned the gesture, their cups clinking gently, and to holding people accountable. In the weeks that followed, the ripples of Alicia's case grew into waves of change. Local businesses scrambled to review their policies, ensuring compliance with anti-discrimination laws. Community organizations rallied around the trial's outcome, using it as fuel to push for broader protections and awareness. The message was clear. Discrimination would no longer be met with silence. Alicia became a symbol of strength and resilience, her story reaching far beyond the courtroom. Invitations to speak at events and panels poured in, and she found herself sharing her journey with audiences eager to listen. At each event, she spoke with a quiet strength, her words resonating not as those of a victim, but of a person who had refused to accept injustice. One evening, after addressing a packed room at a community event, Alicia stepped outside onto the steps of the center. The crisp night air filled her lungs as she gazed out at the city lights, twinkling in the distance. The fight had taken so much from her time, her energy, her peace of mind, but it had also given her something she hadn't expected: purpose. As the cool wind brushed against her face, she whispered to herself, "This is just the beginning." The city around her buzzed with life, but Alicia stood still, grounded by the weight of her resolve. The fight wasn't over. There were still countless battles to be fought, countless voices to be lifted, but Alicia knew she wouldn't be fighting alone. She had proven that injustice could be confronted, that voices could be heard, and that change was possible. And now, standing on the cusp of a new chapter, she was ready to keep going, one step at a time.